Good morning. Good morning. I'm Jill Ernst, co-president of the New Canaan Beautification League with Robin Bates Mason. We're happy to welcome over 200 people this morning, and we're thrilled to have an excellent presentation from Doug Tallamy to kick off our first program of the year. These monthly programs are open to the public, but you can also become a member of our group by looking on our website. Now Steve will introduce Doug.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us today. Doug Tallamy is the T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he's authored over 100 research publications and has taught insect-related courses for more than 40 years. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. He's the author of several books, including Nature's Best Hope, published in 2020, and his latest book, The Nature of Oaks, published in March of 2021, of which I have a copy right here, and which is the subject of today's talk. The books are available at the Elm Street Books in New Canaan, and I highly recommend you pick them up. They really are terrific. He's the co-founder of the Homegrown National Park, which you should also definitely check out at homegrownnationalpark.org. He's the recipient of numerous awards for his work. His writing and talks have served as an inspiration to anyone interested in creating an environment that is more hospitable to native species of insects, plants, trees, birds, and other wildlife. And lastly, he's been directly helpful to us here in New Canaan. When our local pollinator pathway group reached out to him in the spring, he generously provided invaluable expertise that helped get the pollinator pathway resolution passed by the New Canaan Board of Selectmen. Right before I introduce him, I just want to say if you have questions, we will hold them till the end. And if you enter them into the Q&A, where you'll see a link at the bottom of the Zoom screen, if you enter your question, we'll try to get to it at the end of the talk. So without further ado, we're delighted to have Dr. Tallamy as a speaker today, and I'll turn the program over to him now.
Well, thank you, Steve. Let me screen share. There we go. Are we up and running? Yes, I trust. Okay, good morning, everybody. I want to talk to you about what I call the nature of oaks. Let's talk a little bit about oaks, but it's mostly focused on the creatures that depend on oaks. Now, you've probably heard at some point in the last 30 years that insects are the little things that run the world. E.O. Wilson told us that way back in 1987. Problem is, we're losing our insects. Planet Earth has already lost more than 45% of its insects. And that's because of the way we treat the land. Lights kill insects, neonicotinoids kill insects, and the light green areas are all the areas where we're using neonics. Deforestation kills insects, cars kill insects, climate change kills insects. When you take an area like this and you turn it into that, it kills insects. What does this have to do with oaks? Well, there's no better way to address this issue, to share our spaces with the insects that run the world, than to plant an oak. And that's what I want to talk about today. I'm going to start by talking about what oaks have done at our house. This is what my wife Cindy's and my house looked like when we moved in the year 2000 to a property that was a farm that was broken up into 10-acre lots. Before they broke the farm up, they mowed it for hay. And when you mow for hay, we're talking about Oxford, Pennsylvania here, so Southeast Pennsylvania. You mow for hay in that part of the country, you're really mowing the rootstocks of all the invasive plants that have come in. So the multiflora rose and the autumn olive and the oriental bittersweet and so on. So when you stop mowing, that's what it looks like. All those rootstocks grow up very quickly. So when we actually moved into the property, the entire 10 acres was a tangled mess of Asian vines and plants. So step one, before we could start dealing with plants and trees, was to get rid of that stuff. And that's exactly what my wife Cindy did. So here she is working on it. I helped a little bit, but not much. She did most of it. So if you have a bad invasive species problem, don't give up. Think of little Cindy here getting rid of it. You can do it. It is a lot of work, there's no doubt, but it's step one in any type of a restoration. So Cindy got rid of the plants. It was my job to put the plants back. We moved in July, and that October, a couple of white oaks down the street, about 1.5 miles down the street, dropped a lot of acorns. So I gathered up those acorns, planted many of them around the property, and white oak acorns germinate in the fall. So here it is germinating. They put down a root, a radical, and that's all they do in the fall. And then in the spring, they put up their first pair of leaves, and that's all they do then too. And it gives the impression that oaks grow very slowly because they sit there for a long time with just the first pair of leaves. They're actually growing quite rapidly, but most of that growth is beneath the ground. So here's our little oak here. It's surrounded by a deer cage, because if you don't do that, you don't have an oak. During the first year of life, oaks grow 10 times more root biomass than leaf biomass. So it looks small, but it is actually growing quickly. Here's the same tree 18 years later. It's 45 feet tall, circumference of 47 inches, canopy spread of 30 feet. It's still a baby, of course, but it's a real landscape plant, and it didn't take that long. So one of the things I want to focus on today is the fact that oaks really are a lifeline to an awful lot of species. There are dozens of species of birds that depend on oaks, a number of mammals, including rodents, the big guys, bears, raccoons, possums. Not that many reptiles depend on oaks, but there are several species of butterflies that are specialists on oaks, and hundreds of species of moths that depend on them, as well as their predators and their parasitoids. Then we have cynniped gall wasps, which are oak specialists. A lot of beetles, June beetles, longhorn beetles, metallic wood-boring beetles, weevils. When you look underneath the tree in the oak leaf litter, another whole community, including spiders, dozens of species of arthropods and mollusks and annelids. So you're really talking about a very complex community of life that is associated with oaks. And the problem is it goes unnoticed. Most people don't know this. And if it's unnoticed, it's unappreciated. And that's why I wrote The Nature of Oaks. It is a month-by-month guide to the life that is associated with the oaks in your yard. And my goal was to provide the knowledge with hopes that it generates interest. And interest often leads to compassion. And I think we need a lot more compassion towards the natural world these days. So first, a few facts. Oaks are in the genus Quercus. It's a large genus for trees. It contains 91 species in North America, 435 species globally. There are 200 species of oaks in Mexico alone. The word Quercus comes from the Celtic quer, meaning fine, and ques, meaning tree, and oaks are indeed fine trees. There are 4 major taxonomic sections in the genus, and we hear their names, so we'll talk about it briefly. The Quercus group is the white oak group. Lobate is the red oak group. Varieties is the live oak group, and a much smaller protobalanus group, canyon oak group, in the west. This is the distribution of oaks. There's at least one species of oak that occurs every place except the brown areas. So in the high plains and the mountainous regions of the Rockies, the oaks drop out. But the center of distribution is down in the southeast here. Still a lot of oaks right up through Maine. California, I think, has 38 species of oaks. So they're common in most parts of the country. They live a lot longer than we think they do. The average lifespan for an oak is 900 years, 300 years of growth, 300 years of stasis, and 300 years of decline. And during each one of those periods of growth, they are delivering unique ecosystem services. And we'll talk about why many of our oaks don't actually live that long. It's typically because of something we've done to them. What's the oldest oak in the country? It could be the Penchenka oak in California, a coastal live oak. It's estimated to be 2,000 years old. But if you really want the oldest oaks, again, go to California. There are species that are low growing, grow right along the ground, almost like a ground cover. This is the Palmer oak, and they root in one place, then they grow very slowly, then they'll root over here again, and they keep growing. This specimen has been estimated to be 13,000 years old. So some of the very oldest organisms on the planet are oaks. They can get big. They don't all get big, but some of them can get huge. This was the Y oak in Y, Maryland. It was the largest white oak in the country. I got to see it before it blew over in a hurricane. Boy, it's got to be 20, 25 years ago at this point. But it was a big fella. But one of the things I want to, again, stress is that not all oaks are large, and there are ways we can get smaller species into our yards, even when they're small. And then finally, we're going to talk about how oaks have superior ecological function. They have the highest biodiversity value, meaning they are supporting more species than any other type of tree. They're sequestering more carbon dioxide. Of course, pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, out of harm's way, building their tissues out of that carbon, and then pumping the extra carbon into the ground through their root system, where it can be very stable. Once carbon is in the ground, it can be stable for thousands of years. They're the best soil stabilizers because of their large root systems. They make the best leaf litter, meaning it lasts the longest. A single oak leaf, once it falls from the tree, can last up to 3 years before it's broken down. And it's doing its leaf litter job while it's doing that, which is longer than other tree species. And all of that promotes healthier watersheds. So I started the book in October. People want to know why I started in October. That was when Cindy said, you should write a book about oaks. And I looked out the window. It was October, so there's our tree. And that's the tree we're going to follow through the entire year. And of course, October is when you're going to be thinking about acorns. Late September and early October is when those acorns really start to drop. And it's one of the major features that people associate with oaks. Oaks make a lot of acorns. A single oak can produce up to 3 million acorns in its lifetime. And each one of them is a discrete, very rich package of food that a lot of animals depend on. They're very rich in fat, very rich in protein. And I do mean a lot of animals. A number of rodents depend on acorn falls. But again, the big guys do as well. Black bears are roaming the woods in the fall, eating as many acorns as possible. What they want to do is put on a layer of fat to help them get through the winter, and acorns are a wonderful way to do that. Other mammals do as well, raccoons and possums and squirrels, and of course, those very cute deer. They all love acorns. And so do many birds, including turkeys. Turkeys are doing just what the black bears are doing. They're walking around all fall long, eating as many acorns as possible to build up their fat reserves to get them through the winter. Red-bellied woodpeckers, titmice, towhees, believe it or not, nuthatches, flickers, all these things really love acorns. And many ducks do too, especially wood ducks. Any acorn that's viable, when it falls into the water, it sinks. So the wood ducks will dive down and get those acorns, and they come up on the shore and eat them as well. Then there are a number of invertebrates that use acorns. This is an acorn weevil larva tunneling out of the acorn. That's what the adult looks like. They can be extremely common in acorns. Another group of insects called acorn moths are doing pretty much the same thing. The caterpillar is inside the acorn, and when it matures, it tunnels out and then becomes a moth. This is a species complex. There's a number of species. They all look the same, so you actually need DNA to separate them. So you have all these things eating acorns, which means a week, 2 weeks after those acorns fall, if you look under the tree, it's utter destruction. You can't find a viable acorn left. They're carried away, they're eaten, they're crushed. And you might wonder how oaks ever successfully reproduce. Well, this is where a very ancient mutualism comes to the rescue. It's a relationship between jays of all species, and oaks. Both the oak lineage and the jay lineage evolved in the same place about 56 million years ago in what is now the Arctic. It was not the Arctic then. And right away, they liked each other. The oaks, of course, provided food for jays that helped them get through the wintertime. And jays enabled oaks to move farther and faster than any other tree genus in the world. And this is how that works. Jays store acorns for winter food. They don't cache them, so they're not putting a whole bunch of acorns in the same place the way squirrels and some other things do. They'll bury them singly. So what they do is they pick up an acorn, and then they'll fly up to a mile from the parent tree. And actually, I read the other day, somebody says 1.5 miles. It's a long way before they actually bury that acorn. They'll find a disturbed area on the ground, then they tap the acorn beneath the soil surface. Now, if they think another jay has watched them do that, they'll wait around for a few minutes, then they'll dig up their acorn and move it to a new spot, because jays know that jays steal acorns. And then, of course, during the wintertime, they're going to go back and find where that acorn is and have something to eat. They're very busy in the fall. A single jay can bury up to 4,500 acorns every single fall. But here's the key. They only remember where 1 out of every 4 acorns is, which means a single jay can actually plant 3,360 oak trees each year. And if they're doing that a mile and a half from the parent tree, that's what enabled those oaks to move farther and faster than any other tree genus. It's not just blue jays that are doing this. This is a scrub jay in Oregon, all the species of jays. We've got 7 or 8 species of jays in the country, and they all have an association with oaks. Another bird that has a close association with acorns is the acorn woodpecker. It's a beautiful bird from the Southwest, and they're doing pretty much the same thing that jays are doing. They're storing acorns for winter use, but they don't store them underground. They store them in what we call acorn trees that they have created. These acorn woodpeckers live in family groups. They'll find a snag, a dead tree, and then they carve out little holes that are going to they're little receptacles for the acorns. They stuff the acorns in there, and that's how they store the acorns over the wintertime. They just stuff it in there, very nice little place to hold that acorn. But acorn trees are really valuable resources. They can have 50,000 holes drilled in them, and they exist year after year. So it's a resource worth defending, and a family of acorn woodpeckers will defend those trees from other acorn woodpeckers, because you've got a lot of resources there. So if you end up having an acorn tree in your yard, it becomes enormously entertaining. Okay, November is when you might look back and say, well, gee, there were a lot of acorns this year, or not very many at all. We don't usually have too much in the middle. And when you have a lot of acorns, it's called a mast year, and they literally will produce millions. And when you don't have a lot of acorns, we don't call it anything. We just tend to ignore it. But it's a very asynchronous pattern of reproduction that is uncommon among plants. So of course, ecologists want to explain why oaks mast. Why don't they produce about the same number of acorns every single year? And there are 4 major hypotheses that have been put forth to explain that: predator satiation, predator reduction, improved pollination, and energy partitioning. And we'll talk briefly about each one. Predator satiation. This is an acorn weevil larva outside of the acorn. I said before, they can be common. You can have an acorn weevil in up to 90% of the acorns on a tree. And of course, all those other things, the acorn moths and other things that are eating acorns, are really hammering the acorn production. If oaks produce the same number of acorns every year, the populations of these acorn predators would stabilize around that number, and they really would eat just about every single one. But if oaks vary the number of acorns they make, so let's say they make a whole bunch of acorns one year, then you get a lot of acorn woodpeckers, and you get a lot of squirrels and a lot of deer. Everybody's eating the acorns. And then the next year, they make very few acorns. The huge population of acorn predators will crash. That's predator reduction. And you usually go several years of very few acorns and keeping the populations of the acorn eaters low. And then there's another mast year. And that's where we get predator satiation. The acorn number will swamp the population of acorn eaters, and many of those acorns will actually survive. Improved pollination. Oaks are wind pollinated. They produce catkins. These are the male flowers that release pollen on the wind. And of course, wind pollination is a game of chance. The object is to get your pollen to a female flower. And these are the female flowers here, these little teeny red things. But a single oak cannot pollinate itself because the female flowers are not mature at the same time that that particular tree releases its pollen. So what you need is a whole bunch of trees all over the place releasing pollen at the same time. And if they do that en masse, then the chances of pollination are much improved. Then finally, energy allocation. And by the way, if you're wondering whether oaks can have good fall color, they certainly can. This is a scarlet oak in my yard, beautiful tree in the fall. Energy allocation, there's never enough energy to go around, so oaks tend to partition it more than other plants. Some years they'll use most of their energy for growth and very little for reproduction. Other years they'll use most of it for reproduction and very little for growth. But rarely do they do the same, growth and reproduction in the same year. So those 4 hypotheses could all be acting at the same time. They are not mutually exclusive. December is when you might recognize another feature of oaks that is unusual. And that is that particularly in the white oak group, and particularly in younger trees, they do not drop their leaves. This is a deciduous tree, yet they hang on to their leaves all winter long. An uncommon behavior, and it's called marcescence. So again, we want to explain why are oaks hanging onto their leaves when other trees have dropped them. And the leading hypothesis is this. It wasn't very long ago where the earth had lots of very large mammals, large Pleistocene mammals roaming the earth. So these are the group of large mammals that were in Mexico alone. 3 species of mammoths, the giant sloth that could reach up 18 feet, camels and horses and rhinoceros. I think there are 44 species of rhinoceros back then. Many of these creatures were browsers, just like the white-tailed deer today. And browsers are not eating grass out there. They're eating woody material, particularly during the summer or the winter time. And it's typically buds. That's where the nitrogen is, and they taste pretty good. So if oaks protect their buds by surrounding them with the dead leaves of the previous year, hanging onto those leaves, it's very difficult to get a mouthful of oak buds without getting a mouthful of dead leaves that don't taste very good at all. And the distribution of marcescent leaves supports that hypothesis. They only go up about 18 feet, and then they stop. There's no marcescence at the top of the tree. And that's as far up as those mammals could reach. So it's impossible to test that hypothesis today, but it makes a pretty good story. And marcescence also provides a landscaping trait for oaks that can be very useful. You can use them as a screen even in the wintertime. So if you don't like your neighbor, you can plant a white oak or any member of the white oak group and get some very good screening all year long. Okay, January, it's cold and we don't spend a lot of time out staring at our oaks. But if we did, if we looked up in the oaks, chances are we would see little birds flitting around. We would see our chickadees and we would see our titmice. We'd even see golden crowned kinglets flitting around our trees. Now they're not up there playing. Of course, the chickadees and the titmice are birds that are at our feeder all winter long eating seeds. Now there are no seeds up in the oaks, but only 50% of their diet in the wintertime is seeds. The other 50% is insects and spiders. So maybe they're getting insects and spiders in the oaks, but of course it's wintertime and we entomologists know there aren't any insects in the oaks in the wintertime. But what about the golden crowned kinglet? It does not eat seeds at all. It's entirely insectivorous and it should have migrated. But it doesn't. It migrates a little bit south, but stays up in the temperate zone all winter long, eating insects all day long. So that's the kinglet paradox. What is it doing in the north where there aren't very many insects? It should have migrated. Well, Bern Heinrich, wonderful naturalist, he's a retired entomologist, writes a column for Natural History every month. He doesn't like paradoxes. So he actually looked in the crops of golden crowned kinglets in Maine in January, and he found they were full of caterpillars in Maine in January. And if you look very carefully at your oaks in Maine in January or anywhere in January, you'll find there are caterpillars up there. We don't see them because they look just like sticks. They look a lot like sticks, and they just sit there all winter long. When it gets cold, there's one right there. There are antifreeze proteins that keep the cells in that caterpillar from bursting. So the caterpillar shrinks a little bit, and then when it gets warmer, it swells a little bit. But that's how they make it through the winter. There is no more kinglet paradox. There's actually something to eat up in those trees, and that's what the birds are looking for. So the next question is, what are the caterpillars doing up there in the middle of the wintertime? There truly is nothing for them to eat, and they're just sitting there. And of course, we don't really know, but I think the leading hypothesis is that it gives them a competitive advantage in the spring. Most insects spend the winter as eggs or as pupae or chrysalids. A few spend the winter as adults, but even fewer spend the winter as mature larvae. So if you overwinter as an egg in the spring, you've got to hatch out. You're a tiny little thing. These large larvae can easily outcompete you. Remember, in the spring, you've got brand new leaves. It's a wonderful resource. If you overwinter as an adult, You've got to find a mate and then lay eggs, and then they have to hatch. And again, any caterpillar that's in the trees will outcompete that. So that method of overwintering gives those caterpillars an unlimited resource in the spring. They can finish their growth and pupate and become adults. Okay, February. This is the quietest time in the year for oaks. So it's a good time to talk about what I call oak landscaping myths. I hear all the time reasons why people don't want to plant oaks. They're too expensive. They grow too slowly to use as landscaping trees. I hear people say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. They get too big to use in small lots. And if we do use them, they're going to fall over and crush our house. They're going to lift up our hardscape, our sidewalks and driveways. So, usually associated with myths are some facts. So let's try to separate facts from fiction with each one of these. Are oaks too expensive to use? Well, they can be if you insist on instant gratification. In other words, if you plant a really large oak, and that's what we tend to do. We focus on the largest trees so that they're big to begin with. We're very impatient. But there are problems with that. Of course, the nursery industry has figured out we do like large trees, and they have figured out how to grow large trees in pots, which makes them easy to move around and transplant. Now, there was a problem with that, and that is growing trees in pots creates root-bound situation where the roots go around and around. If you plant a tree like this, those roots will continue to grow and actually strangle the tree. It won't live very long. But these are called air pots. And it is a technology that allows trees to grow in pots without becoming root bound. There's still a problem, though, because the root biomass in a pot like this is very small compared to the above ground biomass, which means there's not many roots to take care of that tree. So the first thing that happens when you plant a tree like this is that it's going to try to rebuild its root mass, and it'll spend years doing that. I ran into this planting in Newark, Delaware, a few summers ago. I should have counted all the trees. There were at least 10 of them. All of them were oaks, and all of them were dead. So there can be problems. They spent a lot of money planting trees that died right away. The other option is a balled and burlap tree, where you essentially cut off all the roots and wrap it up in burlap, make it look nice, and sell it that way. Again, very hard on the trees. But here's the point I'm trying to make. If you plant an acorn the same day you plant one of these balled and burlap trees, in 10 years, that acorn is going to turn into a tree that will be bigger and healthier than this tree, if this one lives. The first thing they're going to do is spend at least a decade trying to rebuild that root system. So this acorn will produce a little tree, grow slowly the first couple of years, and then it really takes off because its root system was never disturbed. In 10 years, it's going to look like this. Not really. This is the angel oak in South Carolina, very large live oak. But this is a perfect tree, perfect size for planting trees. Now, I'm not trying to kill the large tree industry for nurserymen, but I'd love to add this as an option. There's a lot of people that will not spend thousands of dollars for a tree, but they will buy an oak of this size. So I'd like to add that as an option for nurserymen, because it would be a popular one, I'm sure. And of course, there's always the free acorn as well. But that leads us to the next question, and that is, do oaks really grow too slowly? Will we be dead before we can enjoy our oaks? Well, I'm going to address that by having a little race here between my friend Bella and this is the tree we're following. This is the oak that I planted as an acorn. It is 6 years old here, so it has grown a little bit. Bella's 2 years old. Now people say, "Oh, she's our daughter." No, she wasn't our daughter. She's not our granddaughter, but she was our surrogate granddaughter until we found real ones. We actually saw a lot of Bella in the early years, and this was her favorite tree. When she was crying and as an infant, we'd take her out and she'd hang on to the leaves, and she loved it. So Bella actually her parents are tall. I figure this is a good time to test how fast oaks grow. So here she is at 2. The oak is 6 years old. The oak is 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Bella's losing. 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, And 2020, Bella's got her mask on, so we know what year it is. She has clearly lost the race, and this is one myth I'm going to throw away. Oaks do not grow too slowly if you can get past that first couple of years where they're building that big root mass. And Bella did well. She's 5'11", so but she still could not outpace the oak. And remember, this is a white oak. They're supposed to grow very slowly. But here's a really important point. You don't have to wait all of those years for your oak to start to contribute ecologically to your landscape. One of the most important things oaks do is provide energy to local food webs by supporting insects, particularly caterpillars, and they will do that the very first year. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that tree. You do not have to wait decades or hundreds of years for your oak to start to contribute, and that, of course, is one of the major goals of planting our landscapes these days. Do oaks become too large to use in small yards? Well, you're not going to get a landscape architect or a landscape designer to spec a large oak for a small yard anywhere today. But they used to do that in the old days. There's a street as I drive into the University of Delaware that is lined with very large red oaks and pin oaks that on very small properties. They obviously were planted probably when the houses were built, which was at least 100 years ago, I think. I remember 100 years ago, there was no air conditioning. So these oaks were supplying valuable ecosystem services. They were lowering the temperature of that house by at least 10 degrees in the summertime, excuse me. But of course, they are large trees. Look, they have not lifted up the sidewalk. They haven't destroyed the road. So they used to do it and get away with it. They also haven't crushed the house. This is a very large oak next to a very large church. Unfortunately, they didn't cut it down when they built the church. But again, you're not going to get anybody to spec that. This is the Gary oak, or the Oregon white oak in Portland, Oregon. Very large tree on a very small property. Point is, we do have small options. In the east, the dwarf chestnut oak is the most popular one, Quercus prinoides. A little farther south, the Georgia oak has been in the trade, a number of what we call scrub oaks. There's a dwarf version of the live oak from the south, or Quercus virginiana minima, that can be used. The yellow highlighted ones are all the species of small oaks that occur in Texas alone. So there are more in the west than in the east, but the real trick here is getting more of these species into the trade commonly. They've all been in the trade at one point or another, but we need to increase the demand so that they are commonly offered. This is a dwarf chestnut oak in my yard. They produce acorns when they're 5 feet tall. So it's a great option for a small property. But here's another option, creating copses through coppicing. Let your oak get maybe 2 or 3 inches in diameter, cut it off at the base, and it will come back as a bush. It's not something that's done very often, and probably never done on purpose, but it's a way to get a very large tree into a very small property. You can cut it off at the base every time a leader takes over. You can do that for a century, and that's no problem at all. You get the valuable contribution of oak foliage to your yard without having a large tree. And here's one I found just the other day. This is in Portland, Oregon. It's a white oak, Oregon white oak coppiced, hanging onto its marcescent leaves in the wintertime. So it is an option for small yards. Are oaks going to crush your houses? Well, they can. And if they do, you will hear about it. Not just oaks, any of the large trees. Because the news media, there's a rule. You can only report bad news. You're never going to hear a report of the oak that did not fall over and crush your house. And it gives the impression that every time you plant a tree, it's going to destroy something. Well, we do have tree blowdowns, and we have them largely because of the way we plant our trees. We want every tree to be a specimen tree, so we isolate it from other trees. We don't want it to compete for light or nutrients or water. It can attain its full splendor, but then you get a windy, rainy period, and over they go because there's nothing holding those roots together. This is the way trees grow in the forest, not just oaks, but all of them. They form a matrix of roots that become very stable. They interlock each other. Very tough to blow them down. This is a stream cut near my house where the water has washed away the soil. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 different trees here, and you can see how they form a matrix, extremely stable matrix. So nothing's going to blow these trees over. You might get a tornado that snaps them off, And there's no landscaping trick that's going to protect you from that, but they won't blow down. So rather than focus on this, why don't we do this? These are the two white oaks that dropped the acorns when we first moved in down the street. That's 3 feet distance there. Now, nobody planted them. They planted themselves. They are still alive, doing quite well. They put the street in afterwards. Neither one has attained its size that it would have if it had been isolated, but they are protecting each other. The object is to start thinking of trees in terms of little tree groves, so that our eye takes in all of the trees in a tree grove at the same time. Here are 3 red oaks in Northwest Connecticut. They're called the Three Sisters. So you can easily go out into the woods and find situations like this. And this is a planned planting at Mount Cuba Center in Hockessin, Delaware. It's one of the DuPont estates dedicated to native plants. This is a large red oak in the background here, hemlocks in the foreground, rhodies that are actually quite large, a little bit of hardscape down here. So this was a planned garden, but it looks totally natural. All of the roots of these trees are interlocked with each other. So if you look around and you say, well, geez, I've got 4 or 5 acres of lawn, how can I reduce that? Think about a tree grove like this. Not only will your trees be stable, but you'll create some very valuable habitat for the life around you. Are oaks going to lift up your hardscape? Well, again, they can, depending on what you plant them over. So this is a pin oak that is not interfering with the street at all. And that's because its roots can go deep enough to get underneath the planting. These are 2 red oaks at the University of Delaware, very large trees right next to the curb, no problem at all. But if we'd planted these trees over bedrock, of course, the roots will go laterally and lift up anything. If you plant them over agricultural pan, so when you know your house is over what used to be a farm, where the plow went down maybe 15, 18 inches every year for a century, the ground beneath where that plow went becomes very compacted, and it's called pan. Well, tree roots will go down and hit that pan and go laterally as well. So if you know you're over an old farm, make sure you break up the pan with a pickaxe or a ripper dragged behind a tractor, and then your tree roots will go deep enough and you won't have any problems with lift up. Okay, March. We are moving along. This is when those marcescent leaves finally do relax and fall from the tree, and they start to accomplish their role as leaf litter. First, let's talk about the variation in oak leaves. A lot of people think that all oak leaves are lobed. That's not true. Many of them are not. When they are lobed, they can have pointy lobes, that's the red oak group, or they can have rounded lobes, that's the white oak group. But they don't have to have lobes at all. This is a shingle oak. This is a water oak. This one looks like a holly leaf. It's an emery oak from California or from Arizona. Willow oak looks like a willow tree. This is a live oak leaf. So there's a tremendous amount of variation in oak leaf shape and size, and oaks make a lot of leaves, 700,000 leaves on a mature tree. And if you line them all up next to each other on a tennis court, they will cover 4 tennis courts. And that's their job, to cover the ground. The soil community houses an extremely important group of organisms, both plants and animals, and that their major job is to recycle nutrients and get those nutrients to tree roots. That's what mycorrhizal fungi are all about. But where are the nutrients coming from? They're coming from the leaves that the tree used the previous year. So when leaves fall from your tree, you want them to stick around on the ground until all of those critters in the soil can break them down, return the nutrients to the soil, and then the tree can use them in a future year. If we rake our leaves away, we've thrown away the nutrients that the tree needs. And when you do that for 50 years, of course, your oak is not going to live as long as it needs to live. All of the organisms in the soil require high humidity. So that's one of the major jobs of leaf litter, is to maintain the soil moisture level so that it can harbor all the species that are detritivores, that are breaking down those leaves. There are more species that live underground than above the ground. So it's a vibrant community. They're all tiny, so we don't tend to appreciate them. Now, a lot of people worry that if you leave a leaf litter on your beds, your plants won't be able to get through. This is just an example of how easily plants can get through leaf litter. It's a normal layer of oak leaf litter. These ferns all grew through without any help from anybody. I just stopped on the side of the road and took its picture. These are wood poppies at my house. I'm never home, so I don't get to rake the leaves. They just come through in the spring, no problem. You can use leaf litter. Leaf litter, by the way, is the very best mulch. This is native Pachysandra, Virginia creeper. All kinds of plants will do very well without removing leaf litter at all. So if you take a single square meter of oak leaf litter, there are a lot of things living in there. 250,000 mites, 100,000 springtails, little columbullins like the sminthuride here, 90,000 proturans. Those are primitive insects. You almost need a microscope to see them. 1 million nematodes. It's a thriving community. And again, their job is to break down that leaf litter, return the nutrients to the soil so that your tree can take them up again in future years. Some of the beautiful things that we appreciate on oaks depend on leaf litter as well, like the banded hair streak. It's a specialist butterfly, and that's what it eats, dead oak leaves as a caterpillar. You're never going to find the caterpillar in there because they're really cryptic, but it's a pretty common butterfly, so they are down there. And there are 70 species of moths, we call them litter moths, that, again, the caterpillars eat dead leaves. Things like the ambiguous litter moth, the American idea, the dark-spotted palthus, and 67 other species that form a valuable resource, particularly for birds. If you watch your white-throated sparrows or your juncos or other things during the wintertime, it looks like they're doing a little dance. What they're doing is kicking leaves back with their hind legs, and they're looking for the larvae or the adults of these guys. And they're there only if we leave the leaf litter. And then you have a whole community of predators that are preying on all of these guys, a number of species of carabids and centipedes and other things, including our lightning bugs, our fireflies. They're not bugs or flies, they are beetles. This is what an adult looks like, and that's its lantern that lights up. You're all familiar with that, but this is what the larva looks like. That's a larval firefly. It's a predator in leaf litter, but only if you leave the leaf litter. So I hear all the time, how come we don't see fireflies the way we used to when we were kids? Well, if you put the leaf litter back and if you stop using ChemLawn and get rid of all the toxins we use, the fireflies will return. Okay, April is when we get the first bud break of the new year. And it's a time where we have the option of seeing one of the most ephemeral interactions that happens in all of nature. It lasts about 5 minutes a year. It's pretty common during that 5 minutes, but you have to be looking at the right 5 minutes. And I'm talking about when cynipid gall wasps lay their eggs in oak buds. And that's what's happening right here. This is a cynipid gall wasp female. That's her ovipositor, and she's injecting an egg into this oak bud. This is a male cynipid gall wasp. He has already mated with this female, so the egg she's injecting has been fertilized by this guy. He's hanging around because she's going to go to another bud and lay another egg, and he wants to make sure that he's the father of that egg as well. This is a male who wishes he was this male. So here she is. She's injecting her egg into an oak bud. But not only is she injecting an egg, she's injecting plant hormones that will direct the growth of the cells in this bud. The cells in tree buds are essentially like stem cells. They are undifferentiated meristematic tissue that can grow into lots of different shapes. Well, the plant hormones that the cynipid gall wasp injects is going to interact with the plant hormones that are already in the bud to come up with a compromise shape. And we call that a gall. And they are extremely species specific. So species specific that you can identify the species of galler just by the shape of the gall. A lot of people think galls or they use the analogy of galls being like cancerous growths. I don't like that analogy because cancerous growths are uncontrolled growth. Galls are highly controlled growth. And there are a lot of them. There are more than 1,000 species of cynipid gallers that are associated with oaks. A single oak tree can have up to 70 different species of gallers on it. It's very hard to find an oak tree without at least some galls on it. And many of them are hollow. This is the apple oak gall or the oak apple gall. And that's another curious feature. If you cut it open, there's nothing but air in here. And then you've got this hard central disc. If you cut that open, that's where the actual gall larva is. But what's all this empty space all about? Well, that's a good question. It turns out that gallers have more natural enemies, more hymenopteran parasitoids, other wasps that are attacking them than any other type of insect. They're in this gall, they're sitting ducks, and these guys are all of them all the time. This is a pterimid wasp with a very long ovipositor. And the shape of the gall has evolved to try to separate the galler from the synipid parasitoids by creating a space that is longer than the length of the ovipositor of the natural enemy. So the galler has got to be separated from the outside of the gall by a space bigger than the length of this ovipositor. So the galls are small in the beginning, and that is when they are vulnerable to being parasitized, but they grow very quickly and get that galler beyond the point of danger in just a few days. This is a species of pterimid in California, Pterimus californicus, that has the longest ovipositor, and it has resulted in the largest gall in the country, trying to separate the gall wasp in the middle from the outside of the gall, where it's vulnerable. A lot of variation in gall form and size and shape. Some of them are quite pretty. Many of them are just spheres on leaves or spheres on twigs. Some of them are quite beautiful, though, particularly in the far west. They look like candy, or they look like that. Many of them look like plant diseases. We mistake them for diseases. This is a spindle gall from California, more candy galls. This is looks like pottery from my yard. This is the cutest one, little gnome house gall. The hole there is the entrance after the galler has left the gall. I call this the brain gall. These are all my common names here. Here's an interesting one. You got a single leaf that has produced 4 galls from 4 different females, but she laid a lot of eggs in each gall. So the holes are the emergence holes where all of the adult gall wasps came out. So this single leaf produced, what, a couple hundred at least adult synipid gall wasps. And galls have played an important role in our recorded history. If you grind up a gall like this and add particular chemicals, it makes an indelible black ink. And that is the ink that was used to record human history for thousands of years. The Bible was written with gall ink. The Magna Carta was written with gall ink. The Declaration of Independence was written with gall ink. All the writings of the scribes and monks and Leonardo da Vinci and everybody in the Middle Ages were written with gall ink. So that's a little factoid you can share at your next cocktail party. Okay, May is when the new biological year really jumps forward because the leaves are finally expanding. And that happens all over the temperate zone, not just with oaks, but with all the trees. And following the expansion of those leaves comes the caterpillars that eat those leaves. And following the caterpillars that eat those leaves come the birds that eat those caterpillars. It is no coincidence that bird migration follows very closely the expansion of leaves and the arrival of all those caterpillars, because that is the food that fuels spring migration. Remember, there are no berries and there are no seeds produced by plants in the spring. They haven't made them yet. So birds are flying north to eat all the insects that are up here in the springtime. Birders know that if you're going to look for warblers in particular, you go to oaks because that's where they go. I had a student, Christy Beal, several years ago who actually measured warbler foraging time on different tree families in large cemeteries. So this is the Fagaceae, this first bar here. That's the family that has oaks and beeches and chestnuts in them. But there were no beeches and chestnuts in her sample size. So this is all oaks. This is the number of minutes that migrating warblers spent foraging on these trees, compared to pines, compared to beeches or birches and so on. So obviously they're going to oaks more than anything else, and they're going there because that's where the caterpillars are. Most of the insects that they're eating are caterpillars, very rich in protein and fats. Things like the purple-crested slug, the buck moth, the white-marked tussock moth, the saddle prominent, double-line prominent, white-dotted prominent, the checkered fringe prominent, the laugher, the lace-cap caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the skiff moth, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the banded tussock moth, the red-lined panapoda, the yellow-neck caterpillar, the smaller parassa, the unicorn caterpillar, the crown slug. These guys are called slug caterpillars because their head is tucked up underneath, not because they're really slugs. The streaked dagger moth, the epilated dagger moth, the lesser-oak dagger moth, the greater-oak dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the red-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the confused woodgrain, the spiny oak slug, and my favorite, the spun-glass slug, and literally hundreds more species of caterpillars are found on oaks. This is what our yard looks like today. We put a lot of the plants back. And my research has shown that if you count the number of species of moths that are living in your yard, in your local food web, you have a very good measure of how complex and stable and productive your food web is. And that's what I've been doing for the last 5 years, is taking a picture of every species of moth that I have found in my yard. I'm up to 1,199 species of moths. I haven't gotten to the butterflies yet. The important point is 28% of them are using oaks, and oaks only comprise 1.5% of the woody plant diversity in our yard. That makes oaks really important in terms of making bird food, which is why we have recorded 60 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres, not flew by, but bred. So I call oaks keystone species. They're not the only keystone species, but they are the best one. Remember what a keystone is. It's the stone in the middle of the Roman arch. And if you take that stone out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because they are making most of the food. Just 14% of our plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives our food webs. And oaks are the best of the keystone plants. Across the country, they're supporting more than 950 species of caterpillars. No other plant genus comes close to that in terms of allocating energy to local food webs. So I talk about caterpillars. Why do we need so many caterpillars? Who cares about caterpillars? Well, it turns out that caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So when we design landscapes that make a lot of caterpillars, we have a healthy, sustainable food web, a healthy, sustainable ecosystem. And when we don't have a lot of caterpillars, the food web collapses. And it's not just for those migrating birds that we need caterpillars. The residents need them as well. I'm sure you've seen the chickadee statistic. It takes 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to make one clutch of chickadees to get them to the point where they leave the nest, where they fledge. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. So tens of thousands of caterpillars required to make one clutch of a bird that's 1/3 of an ounce, 4 pennies worth of bird. So who's going to make all those caterpillars? It's going to be one of our oaks. Okay, June was cicada month. I don't believe you guys had cicadas last year, but it was an exciting time of year for entomologists, so let's talk about it briefly. This was the emergence of the periodical cicada. We have both the 17-year and the 13-year broods scattered around the country, mostly in the east. So at my house, we had the 17-year cicada emerge. And of course, it's very predictable. They all come out in about a week. The news media knew they were going to come out, so they had a lot of fun trying to scare us. They said it was going to be a terrible scourge. We should all be afraid of it. It's an invasion. They're going to sing so loud that it will drive you crazy and you'll kill your babies. You might consider moving before you have to endure this terrible, terrible thing. Of course, it's none of those things. It's one of the most fantastic biological events that you ever be privileged to witness. And it was a big one. These are the shed skins of the cicadas that emerged right next to an oak tree in the front of my building at the University of Delaware. And when they come out, of course, they leave a hole that aerates your soil. You don't have to pay anybody to do it. So it allows moisture and oxygen down to the roots, very valuable ecosystem service. And there were a lot of them. So many that 11 Mississippi kites flew up to Newark, Delaware, and stayed for 2 weeks eating our cicadas. So a lot of people came to see the kites. They didn't care about the cicadas. Briefly, the life cycle, they come out at night. They hang upside down from a tree. This is the last instar nymph. They split the back of their skin. The adult hangs down, then swings up, hangs from the front. This is called an exuvii. And they're like a soft-shell crab at this point. They're extremely vulnerable, which is why they do it at night. And they've got to hang there until they tan their exoskeleton, until it becomes hard and protects them. It takes a couple of hours, but once they have tanned, then they fly off and they start their life cycle. So if you're a male cicada, what you want to do is sing and attract a female. You're singing by vibrating 2 membranes in your thorax. They're called tympanums, just like your eardrum. You don't really vibrate them, you click them. Like a Coke can, click, 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 click. But they do it really fast, about 400 times a second, and it makes a buzz. And the louder you buzz, the greater your chance of attracting females, because females like loud buzzing males. It's a signal of how healthy they are. That guy was very healthy. He attracted a female. They mated, and now it's her turn So what she's going to do is inject eggs into twigs of trees, and they really like oaks. This is a female. This is her ovipositor, and she's jamming it into the twig of pin oak in my front yard, which is hard to do. Get a pin and try to stick it into an oak branch. You're going to bend the pin before you get it in very far, but she can get it in, no problem at all, and she will lay an egg. 1 egg, 2 egg, 3 eggs, 4 eggs. She just marches right down the stem, 6 or 7 eggs in a row, and then she'll go to another branch and do the same thing. And typically from the point where the eggs are laid out, the branch dies. This is called flagging. It upsets people because they say, oh, the cicadas are going to kill my tree. They're not going to kill your tree. They're just going to prune it a little bit once every 17 years, and that's okay. The eggs then hatch. The little guys fall to the ground, tunnel underneath the ground, and start sucking on plant roots where they're sucking xylem. Xylem is essentially water. There's very few nutrients in there. It's one of the reasons it takes them so long to mature as adults. You can have up to 50,000 nymphs on a single tree, set of tree roots, without any measurable effect on the tree at all. I had a student go around Newark, Delaware, measuring where there was the most flagging. These green bars are oaks. So the cicadas really do seem to be preferring oaks. They'll lay on other trees, but they prefer oaks. And then they die. It takes about 3 weeks, and they're gone for another 17 years. The obvious question is, why do they spend 17 years underground? And again, the leading hypothesis is predator satiation. There is no predator that can specialize on something that only comes out once every 17 years. So you have squirrels, you have birds, they all love to eat the cicadas, but there's never enough of them to handle the millions of cicadas that come out all at once every 17 years. Okay, July, this is when the night chorus begins. And by night chorus, I'm talking about when katydids start to sing. It's the male katydid that sings just like the male cicada. The first pair of wings, they hold them up a little bit and rub them back and forth across each other. There's a scraper and a file on this sclerotized part of the wing, and it makes a typical katydid sound. Why are katydids singing? Well, this is why. Once upon a time, there was a young woman named Katy who fell in love with a handsome young man. Alas, he did not share her feelings, and he married another. Soon thereafter, he and his young bride were found poisoned in their bed. Who perpetrated the crime was never determined, but some say the insects in the trees were watching that night, and each summer they solved the mystery by singing, "Katydid, Katydid." That's a sound I'm sure that you have heard. It's very common in our eastern forests. We have 4 species of katydids that frequent oak forests in the east, only 1 species in the west. I did a lot of camping in North Jersey when I was growing up, and katydids sang me to sleep many, many nights. So this is a female katydid with her ovipositor ready to go. She's a last instar nymph, haven't expanded her wings yet. Here they are, the wings are all expanded, and she's going to listen for the loudest male. So same story, the male wants to be loud because that is what attracts the female. And she will mate, and then she will lay her eggs. They're very large, flat eggs that she'll glue to a stem. Sometimes people find them and wonder what they are. These guys have already hatched. Typically, it's happening up in the canopy, so we don't see it very much. But katydids can be very common in our woods. They will sing from mid-July right through August into September and stop singing when it gets so cold that it kills them. So speaking of August, this is a time that is very tough to depend on oak leaves because oak leaves themselves get very tough. In the spring, of course, they are viable or pliable. What are they? They're soft and very nutritious. Lots of things eat oaks in the spring, but by August they become stiff as boards. They're loaded with tannins and lignans, very difficult to eat. But there are insects that specialize on oak trees in August, and they do it in a couple of different ways. One very common way is to be gregarious. Everybody eats together. It's easier to get through those tough leaves when you have a lot of little mouths than if you are alone. This is the yellow-neck caterpillar. It's common on our oaks in early August. Here they are as older instars. It's a pretty big caterpillar, and they can eat quite a few oak leaves. This is the orange-humped oakworm and the pink-striped oakworm. So gregarious feeding is a common way to get around that leaf toughness. I walked around the tree that we're following in 2014, and just on the lower branches, counted all of the caterpillars that I could find at the end of July. And it turned out to be 410 of them. 115 were yellow neck caterpillars. And then I stood back and took this picture so I could ask you, how many of those caterpillars do you see? You don't see any. And how much caterpillar damage do you see? You don't see any of that either. Yet there were 410 caterpillars here. If I knocked on your door and said, you got 410 caterpillars just on your lower branches, most people would freak out, get the spray can, call the man, save the tree. You don't have to save the tree. Very important point here. Oaks are really good at passing on the energy, some of the energy that they capture from the sun. And because they're willing to pass it on to other organisms, we have other organisms in our ecosystems. We have functioning ecosystems. If you call the man, if you spray, you've just killed the whole thing. I met a woman in New Orleans several years ago, Tammany Baumgarten, who suggests we practice the 10-step program. Take 10 steps back from your trees and all your insect problems disappear. And I think that's great advice. And that, of course, is the distance at which we typically view our trees. Another way to get around leaf toughness is to become a leaf miner. The toughness is in the cuticle, the upper epidermis and lower epidermis. That's where all the toughness is. The palisade mesophyll, the parenchymal cells in the middle of the leaf are soft, and that's where the nutrition is. So if you get really thin and really small, you can mine those leaves just like you're a coal miner. And that's what's going on here. This is a serpentine leaf miner. It's actually made by a caterpillar. The egg was laid here, and then the little guy started mining the leaves. It expanded as he got bigger, and then he pupated here. The black line is his frass, his poops. He pushes it all to the middle. And that's the entire amount of leaf material that he eats. Doesn't hurt the oak tree at all. This is a blotch leaf mine. Here's the caterpillar in here, and it just goes in a circle making a blotch. Here it is backlit, and here it is with a very nice picture from Salvador Batanza. It doesn't look much like a caterpillar because it's got all those specialized adaptations for leaf mining. But when it comes out as an adult, it does look like a moth. They're tiny, but most of them are very pretty too. This is one of the Chamameria species. We got the solitary oak leaf miner, the gregarious oak leaf miner, the oak tentiform leaf miner, many species of leaf miners on oaks as a mechanism for getting around that leaf toughness in August. Okay, September, our last month. This is when you're going to notice crickets on the ground. Typically, the black crickets start to sing. And by the way, if a cricket gets in your house and sings, it's good luck. So certainly don't kill it. But there are also bush and tree crickets that are up on vegetation, including oaks. And they're doing the same thing. The males are singing so they can attract females. But these guys they're a little smarter about it. They know that a female is going to go to the loudest male. So they find a hole in a leaf, or they chew a hole of the appropriate size. They stick their head through that hole, lift up their wings, grind them back and forth, make their little cricket sound. Now, most leaves have a slight parabolic shape, so that projects the sound farther and louder than if he had sung on a flat surface. So he's in effect sending a false message to the females, if you can believe that a male would send a false message to females, saying, I am bigger and louder and stronger and healthier than I really am. And the female falls for it. She comes and she mates with him. And you might say, well, gee, the female was duped, but maybe not, because he might not be the biggest male, but he could be the smartest male, and that could be good enough. It's also the best time of year for finding walking sticks. These are orthopteroid type insects that are called walking sticks because they look like sticks and they walk. This is one I found on an emery oak in Arizona. Typically, they're up in the canopy, so you don't see them very much. But then in the fall, when the leaves start to come down, you can find them. They have an interesting way of reproducing. The females will just walk around in the canopy and drop eggs to the forest floor. Some of those eggs will hatch that year. Others will hatch the next year, and some even wait 2 years to hatch. It's called bet hedging. They don't want all their eggs to hatch in the same year in case conditions are bad in any one year. This is the species that's common in the East. This is a male. But they have another interesting relationship with spring ephemerals. This is bloodroot, of course, and bloodroot, like other spring ephemerals, makes a pod with seeds in it. That pod, when it matures, opens up, dehisces, and you've got these pretty seeds, but they have this little white structure on it. The white structure is called an eliosome, and it turns out that ants really like eliosomes. So the ants will come and they will pick up the seed, they carry it back to the nest, and everybody eats the eliosome. But the seed is hard. They can't eat the seed, so they throw the seed into the garbage dump of the ant nest, which is about an inch below the soil surface, and it's a perfect place for those spring ephemerals to hatch. Well, these are walking stick eggs, and one of the hypotheses is that this white strip here is supposed to be imitating or mimicking an elaiosome. I'll bet there's some chemical mimicry here, but the ants do come along. They pick up the walking stick eggs, they take them to the nest, they find they can't eat them, so they put them in the garbage dump, and it's a perfect, safe place for all those walking stick eggs to hatch. All right, we have made it through the year and talked about just some of the things that are happening on the oaks in our yards. So let's end talking about a problem, but it's a problem we're going to solve. We, of course, have created a biodiversity crisis on planet Earth. We've got two crises. We've got the climate change and biodiversity crisis. And if we had no climate change, we would still have a biodiversity crisis. Because we are not sharing the planet with the creatures that run the ecosystems that support us. We talk about things disappearing. You know, we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years, and we got global insect decline. They're not disappearing, we're killing them. We're killing our birds, we're killing our insects, we're killing the nature that we need to support us. And that's why the Earth is now experiencing the 6th great extinction event that has ever occurred on the planet. So it is a global crisis. The good news is, it has a grassroots solution. It's one that we all can participate in solving. There are 4 things that every landscape has to do today if we're going to reach a sustainable relationship with the Earth that supports us, and an unsustainable relationship is not an option. And those 4 things are capturing carbon, so reducing the climate change threat, managing the watershed in which every landscape lies, supporting a diverse community of pollinators, and supporting a complex food web. When you plant an oak, you're addressing all 4 of those major ecological goals. You're going to capture more carbon over the life history of that oak than other trees. The large root system is going to manage the watershed better. You're going to support a more complex food web than any other type of plant. You're even going to help support a diverse community of pollinators, even though oaks are wind pollinated. Watch those catkins in the spring. A number of species of bees will go there and they gather up the oak pollen, even though they're not moving it to female flowers. They're not actually pollinating. They're still using oak pollen as a valuable resource. So despite all these wonderful landscape attributes, oaks are in trouble today, as so many other things are. The old giants that were in the forests are long gone. We cut them down for agriculture, or we cut them down for their valuable wood. The percentage of oaks in our eastern forests has been cut in half in the last century for several reasons. We've suppressed fire. The Native Americans managed our forests with fire, and that supported oak growth. We've introduced a lot of pests for oaks. Certainly the spongy moth used to be the gypsy moth, and other invasive insects are challenging oaks. Diseases, we've got oak leaf bacterial leaf scorch, we've got oak wilt, we've got sudden oak death syndrome. These things are clobbering oaks around the country. Deer overabundance is a terrible problem for oaks, because every little baby oak that pops up is eaten by the overabundance of deer in our forests, and we're not getting any oak regeneration. And finally, habitat fragmentation. When you separate oaks far enough, then the pollen can't find another oak at the appropriate stage of its development, and you don't have very many acorns produced. So for all those reasons, 28 of our 91 North American oak species are now threatened. 1/3 of the global oaks are endangered. The Oregon white oak, for example, has lost 97% of its range. Used to occur from Southern California all the way up through Washington, because it likes to grow where we have agriculture. 2,300 species that rely on oaks in Great Britain that are now threatened because of the loss of oaks in Great Britain. So we humans live our lives out during a very brief instant of ecological time, and we cannot return the ancient oaks to our landscapes during that time period, but we can start the process. And in no time at all, the oaks that we plant today, the oaks that we plant either this past fall or in the spring, will attain a size where they're going to assume many, not all, but many of their essential keystone roles in our yards. Now, we're all responsible for good earth stewardship because we all require it. Every single one of us requires healthy ecosystems, so we need to share the responsibilities of keeping those ecosystems healthy. And the best way to express or to exercise your responsibility towards earth stewardship is to embrace the power of oaks. So for the sake of our turkeys, our chickadees, our woodpeckers, our warblers, our jays, our thrushes, our lightning bugs, our galls, our weevils, our orthopterids, our moths, ourselves, for our own sake, plant an oak, plant a living community, plant the future. Thanks very much.
Doug, thank you so much. That was really terrific. Really appreciate it. We've got several questions for you. Let me start with something you were just talking about. There was a question about how did managing oak forests with fire actually help to sustain the oaks?
Well, oaks are fire climax community. They're adapted to ground fires. They have very thick bark and they can handle it. Whereas maples and cherries, for example, are not adapted to frequent fires. So that suppresses the competition from many of those other trees, tulip trees, things like that. The trees that now dominate our forests. So that's what that's all about.
You have a question. Someone says if they find a newly germinated acorn, can they transplant it?
Yes, that's the perfect time to transplant it. They do sink that root down, so you want to dig deeply. You try not to disturb the root system, but anytime during that first year, you can move an oak. It's a good time. A lot of people find these germinated oaks in their flower beds where they don't want them, so move them to a place where you do. The most important thing then, though, is to put a cage around it so that the deer don't eat it the next day, which they will.
Another question, if the soil is compacted at the base of the oak tree, will aerating the soil be beneficial to the tree?
That's a tough one because in aerating the soil, you don't want to hurt the root system. So there is what's it called? I forget what it's called, but they put a machine in the soil and then they kind of blow it up.
Yeah.
That has pretty good results. They're very good, very impressive pictures of how that has regenerated root growth and helped trees. Assuming those are all accurate, that seems to work pretty well. But I'll tell you one way you can reduce compaction without going to those extreme measures, and that is to get that good layer of oak leaves, of leaf litter underneath your trees, and then stop walking on it. Make it a no-go place, and the earthworms and all the other things that are under your trees will break up that compaction over time. When we stop compacting our soils, they do become uncompacted, and the root growth itself will make them uncompacted. So if you have a favorite tree and it's not looking good, you want to help it out, maybe hire one of those ground explosion guys, but otherwise just get some good leaf litter under there.
Another question, since moths and caterpillars are key to the food web, what advice do you have for households who install large outdoor lighting systems which attract moths at night?
I'm so glad you asked that. Well, we have the option of turning out those lights, but I know everybody's worried about security. You have the option of putting in motion sensors, so they only turn on when the bad man comes. But the easiest option is to replace the white bulb in the security lighting system with yellow bulbs. Yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to nocturnal moths and other insects than our white or blue wavelengths. So, and there's actually a product now, go to Ace Hardware and they sell, it's called a bug light. It's a yellow bulb and it works really well. So very easy solution to a very serious problem.
Someone asked what organizations they should support if they're trying to save oaks. Are there particular organizations focused on that?
There is I think it's an International Oak Society. They're more studying oaks. Any of the conservation groups are interested in saving oaks along with everything else. And don't forget to join Homegrown National Park. That's what we're all about. Go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org. It's free, and you register your property on the map and the amount of area that you're going to be a good steward of. And that includes any of the oaks that you're going to plant. It's not hard to take care of oaks. The biggest challenge now are all the oak diseases that have come in. So there's two things there. We have to learn to ignore the advice of our arborists who are saying, don't plant any more oaks because they'll just get sick. I'm saying just the opposite. Plant more oaks than ever. And yes, some of them are going to get sick. And what we're going to do is weed out the susceptible genotypes. There is resistance to all these diseases in all of our oak populations. But fortunately, that's not as deadly as the chestnut blight was that killed them all. But we've got pretty good resistance. We just have to support the resistant trees and weed out the susceptible trees. So spending a lot of money trying to save a tree that already has bacterial leaf scorch or something is, unfortunately, is probably a waste of money. It's going to die anyway. But plant, for every tree you lose, plant 10 more. And some of those are going to be resistant. That will be the future. And the blue jays are going to help us here, because the oaks that are sick don't make good acorns. The blue jays will weigh them, they'll pick them up, and they'll say, this one's not good enough. And they'll only spread the ones from healthy trees. So they're actually planting the resistant genotypes over time.
Someone says they have an acorn from the charter oak at the Bartlett Arboretum in their refrigerator. Can they plant it now or hold it to the spring?
I thought the charter oak died 200 years ago. Okay, I believe the charter oak. So you have to know what species of oak it is. If it is the real charter oak, I think it was a white oak, and they germinate in the fall. If you're holding it now and it hasn't germinated, it's not viable. So try to get another one in the fall and plant it right away. If it's a member of the red oak group, then yes, you put it in the refrigerator in some peat moss to keep it from getting full of fungus, with a little bit of moisture, and then plant it in the spring. That's when the red oak group germinates.
Someone is asking whether the oaks devastated on their main property by the winter moth, will they rejuvenate in the following year?
Probably. So the winter moth is another invasive species. There's actually good news with the winter moth. There's now a parasitoid that has been introduced that's controlling them very well. Oaks can be defoliated. And it depends on the quality of the soil they're in, but if it's pretty good soil, they can be defoliated a couple of years without serious harm. If they're on terrible soil, sometimes one defoliation is too many. But certainly give them a chance to come back, because often these invasive insects are very cyclic. They'll be high population one year and then very low for several years. So give them a chance to come back.
Are there oaks native to the Northeast that prefer wet, shady areas next to a wetland?
Yeah, and pin oak's one of those. It's called the oak of the swamp, Quercus palustris. Swamp white oak is another one. There are oaks that do everything. Like the chestnut oak likes high rocky outcrops, and so does the white oak. There are oaks that like acidic soil and oaks that like basic soil. So you want to match up the conditions in your property with the right oak species to get the most healthy tree.
Someone is asking how you got rid of the invasive species on your property before planting the natives.
Well, we tried the way that doesn't work, and that was, moved in, and like a lot of people said, nope, we're not going to use any herbicides. I had Oriental bittersweet vines this big going up trees. The day we signed the papers of the property, I went and I sawed them down, and I felt great. This is 22 years later. I'm still fighting the baby Oriental bittersweets that have come up from that root system. If I had painted that with an herbicide the day I cut it, I would have been done. So what we've learned to do is we worked with the woodies first. We got garlic, mustard, and some other things, but we're not worried about that right now. We worry about the bush honeysuckle and the Japanese honeysuckle and the autumn olive and the multiflora rose, the big guys that are taking over the understory. Saw them off at the base and paint them. It uses very little material, kills the root system, and then you're done. I'm not going to live long enough to do the cut them forever routine, and that's what it boils down to. So that's how we did it. And by we, really, I got to give my wife most of the credit. She loves being outside, and she was out whacking away. And by the way, she won't use herbicides. So she does the I will whack it forever routine. And it does work if you're willing to put in that much labor.
If you're in the Northeast and you've got red oaks, white oaks, pin oaks, lots of different oak species, are there considerations as you're thinking of planting a new oak that you should take into account to make the decision as to which to plant?
Yes. Remember, oaks are wind pollinated. They can't pollinate themselves. So if you want acorns, and you do want acorns, it's a valuable contribution of the oaks, you have to have other members of that species nearby. So if you have a bunch of white oaks and no red oaks anywhere near you, and you plant one red oak, it will not be able to reproduce. So it'll still have valuable foliage, but keep that in mind. You want to go with the dominant oak in your area, at least within pollination range. And oak pollen can move at least 100 yards. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't have to be right next door. But for example, I have somebody gave me a shingle oak way back when, and it is now the biggest oak in my yard, but it is the only shingle oak in town. And every year it makes thousands of acorns, and every year it aborts thousands of acorns because there's no other shingle oak to pollinate them. I feel sorry for it. So
there's a question about songy moths, S-O-N-G-Y, that they're destructive and how best to control them.
Songy moths? I'll have to look that one up. I don't know what a songy moth is. I'm going to write it down. Sorry.
No, that's fine. So look, I really, again, want to thank you. I know that Jill wants to say something in the end, but the talk is really inspiring, I think, to all of us. And as you said, I think going homegrownnationalpark.org for anyone who was inspired by the talk will really kind of show them kind of what resources and what they can do to make their contribution to improving the environment. So thanks again. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for the opportunity.
Turn it over to Jill.
Okay, thank you so much, Doug. My head is just spinning here with ideas. I can't hit the right button so that I don't think I'm looking right on the screen. But one thing I'm excited about is to send this presentation to my granddaughters. All right, I'm going to start my video. Because I think it's very inspiring, and who knows, it might turn them into something in the sciences or even something more specific to what you're talking about here. But I want to thank you so much. And remind everybody that we have these monthly programs. On February 1, we'll be having Irene Barber speak about, what's the name of her thing? Everybody can have a garden, something like that. Look at the website for what it is. Also, this presentation is being recorded and will be on our website shortly. So thank you all for coming, and we look forward to the next time we're all together.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.